Okay, so now let's have a look at one which is not an inbuilt subprogram. This is a subprogram that I have created. I'm actually going to create myself. Okay, so we've got a couple of the inbuilt subprograms that we've already seen, and we've also got one that I have created, this temp convert. So this is the identifier of it. So let's have a look at this. So we are assigning some data to temperature, and we're using one of those inbuilt subprograms. Remember, input is a function because we are sending this data to it. It's going to do something with that. It's actually going to ask the user to put in some data. Whatever their data is going to be sent back to our main program, and it will then be stored in the temperature variable. And again, we're doing the same thing here, C or F equals, and just so you know, at the moment I'm writing this in OCR reference language, and therefore we don't need to worry about integer with regard to temperature, and then C or F is going to be a string. So temperature will be an integer and C or F will be a string. But again, it's that same principle. We're using the input subprogram, the function, we're sending this data to it. It's going to go off and do those little lines of code for us that we don't need to at the moment. It's all abstracted from us. We don't necessarily need to know how or whatever it's doing, whatever it's working. We just know that it is going to then assign, it's going to return something to us that we can then assign to this variable or identifier C or F. What we've then got is we've got a variable that I've decided to call converted. And again, remember, it's just a meaningful variable name. And I'm going to assign some data to this. It just so happens that I have created a subprogram. And at this stage, again, we don't need to even know how that's doing it. We don't need to know the instructions of this subprogram temp convert. What we do need to understand, though, is that because I'm assigning data, it means that temp convert is a function because it's going to return some data to my main program, which needs to be stored in my main program. So I'm going to be storing it or assigning it to this variable name called converted. So the identifier of the function, we've realized it is a function because it's returning data. The identifier of the function is temp convert. And here what you'll see is I'm sending data to it, and I'm sending two pieces of data. They're comma separated, and therefore we've got temperature, which is the input that I've got here. So I'm sending temperature, and then comma, I'm sending C or F. So I'm sending a number and I'm sending a string to it, but both of them held at the moment in variables. If I wanted to, I could actually send them as physical. I could have literally just sent C in speech marks, so the string C. What we'll see here is now, again, what we've got to remember is the whole point of subprograms is that I send the data off, it runs its instructions for me, it returns the result of the calculation or process, and I'm now holding that in converted. And so now I can say, and I'm using the print, remember this is procedure again, your converted temperature is, and just a little bit of string concatenation, because I'm just now saying converted, which is the data that has been returned from my temp convert function. So all of this, really, really important. Let's have a look at some of the main names or terminology that you need to know. So these are variables used in the main program that hold the data that will be sent to the subroutine. So subroutine or subprogram can be used interchangeably. So temperature or C or F are just regular variables in our main program. What we've then got here is our subroutine name, which we found out is a function, or we realized is a function. So when we call the subroutine, we need to use its identifier, and then we have brackets, and the data is known as arguments. We're sending the data through to it, and so I'm not sure why they're called arguments, but they're known as arguments when you send them through to it. And we're sending two pieces of data through to it. Now, in the exam, they might actually just refer to these as parameters, which we will be looking at when we actually look at the function itself. These are known as parameters inside the function. In the exam, I think they're also going to expect these to be called parameters, and I think that's just to make it a little bit easier. Okay, so these are the data that is going to be sent to the subroutine. What we've then got is those variables that we had, temperature and C or F, and they're being used and they're being sent to the subroutine. So these are, like I said, the parameters that the subroutine receives. They must be sent in the same order in which the subroutine is receiving them. So we will look at that in a minute, and you'll see what I mean by that. So when we actually write the subroutine, the function temp convert, it will want to be receiving the data for temperature and then the data for whether it's centigrade or Fahrenheit, in that order. And we have to send them as the correct data type. And you'll see here already, we know that temperature was an integer and CRF was a string. And then what we've got here is, again, this name converted. So this is a variable name that is used to call the function. And remember, I've written this variable name will hold the value that is returned from the function. Now remember, we only need this if it's a function and not a procedure. Remember, a procedure does not return a value back that needs to be stored, and therefore, at the moment, this is a function because we need to store the data that is returned from it. So this variable name is used then again in the main program, you can see here. So we've got that string concatenation. So let's have a look at the function temp convert. Now, often your functions are, like I said, they're just small chunks of code that do a dedicated task. So temp convert is just going to do the task of converting temperature, the number that is given to it, whether it's given it to it in centigrade, it will convert it to Fahrenheit, or if it's given to you in Fahrenheit, it will convert it to centigrade or Celsius. So let's have a look at that code, and I'll explain that through as well. So you'll see here in the exam, they expect you to be able to know whether it's a function or procedure. Now, you'll always know that if it's returning a value, then it is a function. And so the first thing we do is we name it as a function. So this is just saying whether it's a function or procedure. This one's a function. Then we put the identifier, so this is temp convert. And then you'll see in brackets here, we have the two parameters. Now, these do not have to be actually the same name as the data that is sent through to it. So at the moment, these are temperature and CRF, but we'll find out that they don't necessarily have to be the same name, and that's when it can get a little bit more confusing. What you'll see then here is actually, it's a relatively simple piece of code. We've got to realise now is that because procedures and functions or subprograms are just short routines that do a dedicated task. In this case, all it's doing is looking to see if what has been sent through to it, CRF, is equal to C, then we want to convert from Celsius or centigrade into Fahrenheit. So we run the calculation, and you'll see here calculation equals. We're doing a little calculation on the number, and you do not need to worry about this calculation. This is not part of what you're being tested on. So if they do want you to write something like this, they will give you this calculation. So what you'll see here is that we're then assigning F to unit. So calculation is going to do the calculation to convert C to F, and we know then we need to hold that this is now F as in the kind of the unit variable. Then we've got else, and clearly if it's not C, well, the only other option is that it was sent to us as F, and therefore now this calculation is going to be turning a temperature or a number from a Fahrenheit number into a Celsius number. And so we've got calculation equals, and then we do the calculation there, and now we're holding C in the unit because this is now being converted to Celsius from Fahrenheit. So we do a simple little piece of selection here. And then what we've got is we're going to do a little bit of string concatenation, and we're just going to say final equals calculation plus unit. So the new number plus whether it's F or C. Now again, remember this is OCR reference, so you do not need to worry about casting, because obviously string concatenation would mean calculation would need to be turned into or converted into a string. But this is OCR reference language. So at the moment, again, that's OCR kind of tries to abstract that a little bit for you to make it simpler. The most important thing here, and this is what they will test you on in the exam, is that if you know it's a function, then you know somewhere in that function, it's often at the end, but don't always look just for the end. But it's often then here, return final. So remember, final is the data that we're assigning calculation plus unit, the string concatenation to. So final is going to say, let's say 32C. And then we're going to return whatever's held in final, let's say that 32C, back to our main program. So let's just quickly go back to our main program, and you'll see now that if I'd have put, I don't know what it is, like maybe 62F, we're sending it through to temp convert, we're sending that 62 and the F through to it. And so therefore it's coming into here, 62 and F. It's looking through here and it's like, well, okay, I haven't sent it as C, I've sent it as F. It's doing the calculation, and maybe 62 would become, I don't know, maybe 30, I don't know. And unit would become C. So we've now got 30C. And up here, converted is now going to hold that 30C that is being returned from the main program. And therefore, we're going to print your converted temperature is, and that would then come out as that 30C. So this is really important. You've always got two programs. This is your main program, and then you've got your sub-program, and in this case, a function. We know it's a function because it's returning a value, and we know that in our main program, we are calling a function because we're actually needing to assign it. Now, there is a slight difference. Later, I'll show it to you about how you might just print it, but in this case, we are having to assign it to this variable here. So very quickly, let's just again run through the main terminology. So this is what type of subroutine it is. Therefore, it's either a function or procedure. In this case, we know it's a function. Here's the identifier of it, so the name of the subroutine. And these are the parameters. Remember, inside the subprogram, we call the data that it is receiving. So remember, the main program sent temperature and CRF, so it's receiving those two pieces of data that the main program sent to it. And I've written here, a subroutine could have 0, 1, or more than one parameters. They are separated by commas. So quite often you might be asked how many parameters does this function have, and in this case it's got 2. So you just look to see how many pieces of data it's receiving. Each one is separated by a comma. I've said here they can be the same variable names as the main program or different. And at the moment we're using the same variable names that the program was using, the main program was using. But we do have to understand that there's something known as local scope. It basically just means that this little piece of code here has its own variable names, local, just this little, remember it was just like a little module or packaged unit of code, and it uses its own variable names. And so therefore this could have been two different variable names. And I'm going to show you that in a minute as well, just so that you can see that difference. Okay. So local scope, it means that any of the variable names in here, so calculation and unit, are just held inside here. Your main program, if it was trying to look for calculation or unit, wouldn't be able to see it. They're just held inside this. Okay, and like I said, it's just a simple, usually a simple program. In the exam, they will probably ask you to write a function or a procedure, so to write a subprogram, and you have to then figure out what the algorithm is inside it. But actually, quite often, the algorithm is a relatively simple algorithm, because remember, it's just doing a repeated task over and over and over again, a dedicated little bit of instruction code. So in this case, it's just quite a little bit of simple selection. And then don't forget, really importantly, because this is a function, we're returning a value back to the main program that called it. Okay, it doesn't have to be the main program. So sometimes it might just say a program that calls it or uses it. And remember, a procedure does not return a value. So we don't have this line of code in a procedure. And then also, like I've said, these are using OCR language. So we want to show those blocks of code. And the exam really do expect you, whenever you're writing it, to show the indentation. So you'll see here that the function itself, everything is held inside that function. Then we've got the end function. And then you'll see what we're also doing is we're showing the little blocks of code for your if statement. But remember, all of these calculations are still, even though they're not part of the if statement, they are part of the function, and so therefore they're indented. and only do we dedent when we are finished with that function.